What is going on, guys? So in this video, I'm going to just be going over my thought process on how I go about building AI agents. And I've actually done, in the demo I'm going to be using for this video, I've actually already made a video on it, which is going to be this contract agent to ask any questions about our list of contracts. So here's a Streamlit app that kind of shows it where like, can you mark out which contracts have a confidentiality clause? And it will go through our contracts, figure out which have a confidentiality clause. So one thing I also added to this as well though, is being able to actually have this agent do like actual API calls to push data up into Supabase for us. So when it says, can you mark out which contracts have a confidentiality clause? It'll actually go into Supabase and update it with the column has confidentiality clause with true, or like false if it doesn't, obviously, right? But yeah, so we just added things like that. But nonetheless, the whole goal of this video is more so just for you guys to understand my thought process when going about building AI agents as a whole with using this contract agent as the main demo, okay? So let's just give a quick overview of how this works. So how this flow works is there's a user query that comes in. So I'll just say, can you mark out which contracts have a tech upgrade clause? A tech upgrade clause is this definition, and here's an example of one. Because at the end of the day, when we're doing, especially things that affect like a structured database, say like Snowflake, Supabase, whatever it may be, when we're actually having like implications downstream to our data, we want to make sure that when we're doing like clause detection or any type of detection like this, we're actually giving it a definition, one, and an example of it. So if we ran this, right? In this run, I asked, can you mark out which contracts have a confidentiality clause? Give the actual definition of a confidentiality clause with an example. Say if I remove this, what I have as a guardrail actually is if an example or a definition isn't provided. And if we notice in this query that we're trying to actually like make labels in this data set or like create a new column, we're going to actually make sure it has one, it's checking to see if we were actually needing to label it in the database. Two, a definition for what clause we're trying to label for, and three, an actual example to make sure we're giving the LLM the correct information at the end of the day. So if we run this and look at that, error labeling requires a key, a definition, at least one example clause, one or more of these were not extracted. And obviously an example wasn't provided here. But yeah, that's just one thing I always like to keep in mind, like just making sure you have correct guardrails in place with the query especially when you're affecting data downstream like this, or just with any agent, because when building agents, one decision affects the downstream decisions of the rest of the calls, right? Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna identify the question type, okay? But with contract questions, for this client that I built this for, a lot of questions could vary between like about a singular contract. Well, let's just say an example company like for Meridian or like say Bass Pro Shops. Do we have a tech upgrade clause, or like what's our payment structure like with Bass Pro Shops? So if it's a singular company, we're gonna actually just have it. We're gonna label as a single contract type of question, or multiple specific contracts, or all contracts. And a big thing about this, even this is a very like in the grand scheme of things, a minuscule question. One thing I like to point out with agents is, and I see this all the time on Twitter about having agents like decide for you like what it should do. What I like to do when building agents is making it like almost like forcing it into a classification problem. Okay, so right now I'm forcing it to choose between single contract, multi-specific contract, or all contracts. And if it's not clear, then we have the LLM just choose like null, and then that way we could have like a manual decision on it. The reason why we do this is we want to prevent hallucination and variance. Like it just makes things so much more structured. You get so much more consistent outputs when you force the agent decisions to almost be like multiple choice or like classification at the end of the day. So yeah, so we can force it between a single contract, multiple specific contracts, or all contract questions. It's a singular contract. We do a simple RAG approach. So we just retrieve the relevant text, put the text in the query or in the LLM, and we answer it and we give it to the user. And then we just have a validation step from there. If it's a multiple specific contracts, we do the same thing, except we're just pulling the context from each contract and doing the same exact structure. So here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. So we retrieve relevant text from all the contracts. Again, we want to break down all decision making with AI agents into classification problems. Is this query up here, is this going to be requiring labeling within our database, yes or no? So like, is this going to require labeling in our database, yes or no? So the way we said it, can you mark out which contracts have a tech upgrade clause? We're asking in this query to actually update it in Supabase, like not directly, but you get the idea, right? So we're just turning into a classification problem. Are we asking it to label data or not label data? If it's no labeling, can we kind of do the similar structure? We just have an LLM call for each contract to answer the query for each individual contract, have a secondary LLM call to just aggregate all the findings, and we just validate it and then return the answer. But if it is marked for labeling, so say this query up here, right? Then we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna have an LLM call for each contract to answer the query, but we're gonna have a function call as well to update the data in Supabase. Okay, so when we run it for each one, it's gonna actually create the column based off the query. So like, let's just say has tech upgrade clause, let's say would be the name of it. And then it's gonna actually make a column for it, update it. And one thing we do in Supabase as well is for the specific situation, we want to make sure that we have the label definitions in a separate table as well for what we create. The reason being is, what if multiple people ask, let's say, for a confidentiality clause? We're just going to make like 10 different columns in our of confidentiality clauses, which would be a waste of time, right? It will actually detect and return back like, oh, we already have this column. And yeah, we just do that using some string matching tools, okay? And just to give you a demo of how that looks, look, when we put in this query, so again, as I showed you in Supabase, we already have a confidentiality clause labeled in here, right? When we run this query again, we get this warning: proposed label identifies a duplicate of existing label, has a confidentiality clause, and blah, 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 right? So what it does is it still gives you the answer that you need, right? But we don't create a separate column or duplicate column inside our databases, because again, that's just going to clutter everything at the end of the day. But yeah, guys, this was just a quick video just going over how I go about building AI agents, just kind of like my thought process and how I build things. But yeah, thank you guys so much, and hope you guys have a great day.